My name is Chris Collier. I'm the Executive Director of Renew Theaters, which is the management corporation that oversees the Ambler County Highway and Garden Theaters. So I want to welcome all of you from each of our different theaters. On a normal night, I would be absolutely panicked by this forecast that we would have to cancel this event and trying to figure out how to reschedule it. And actually, it's really nice that we are in this virtual environment and we can continue on, all from the safety of our own homes and the comfort and heat of our own homes. I hope everyone is comfortable and doing well. I do want to say thank you to all of our members. This program is made free to our members thanks to a grant from the Vesta Fund, and we are very thankful for them for allowing us to offer this to everyone. Our theaters would not be thinking about reopening if it wasn't for all of our members and supporters who have helped us through this whole extended closure period. Before I turn things over to Maria, I just want to reiterate the Zoom protocols, just that we request that everyone remain on mute unless you're speaking. And we can try with open questions, but if we find that we're stepping on each other's toes or cutting each other off, we'll switch to raising hands or using the chat feature. But Maria and I will help police that and monitor and call on people as needed. So Maria DiBattista, many of you were here last week and heard her wonderful accolades, but for those of you who are just joining us this week, is a professor of English and comparative literature at Princeton University, specializing in the 20th century literature and film, especially the European novel and narrative theory. She has many books, including a couple on Virginia Woolf, but the one that John was just holding up that is most apt for this conversation is her book, Fast Talking Dames, which is a really wonderful compendium exploring screwball comedies and the women in them from this period. So last week we had the pleasure to talk about Libeled Lady, and we have another wonderful film with really wonderful gender roles to break down and explore. And another classic comedy in The Lady Eve. So with that, again, I thank you all for joining us and turn things over to Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. It's good to see. I sort of feel like you're all old friends after last week. So it's really nice to look forward to on this kind of snowy and cold night. I'm not going to say very much because from our discussion last week, and if I actually can't see you all on my screen, but if they're newcomers, I just have the sense this is a group that has a lot to say and many questions to pose. So I want to turn it over to you as quickly as I can. I just thought to sort of set some sort of background for our discussion. The Lady Eve is written, produced, and directed by Preston Sturges. I mean, even saying that is already singling it out as a kind of remarkable motion picture. There were very few directors, if any, that had that much of total control over their productions. The only equivalent would be Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which he wrote and directed and produced as well. So we're talking here about really a kind, what the French would call an auteur, someone who had a vision and could realize it without any interference really, or any major interference from the studio system. Although I have to say, the script for The Lady Eve underwent a few revisions and alterations because it was seen to be initially a little too racy, too spicy. You can see that a lot of the kind of sexual jokes, many of them generated by that snake and all the kind of Freudian puns and symbolism that circle around this, became a little too explicit. So there was, because there was a Hays Code, there was at one point the need to somehow make the dialogue a little more, I would say, sophisticated, okay, not quite as explicit. Although one of the things that makes Preston Sturges such a kind of master of comedy is he's not afraid in some ways to be vulgar, okay, to be common, to sort of go for the pratfall. So this is probably if not one of the most sophisticated comedies to come out of the golden age of Hollywood. I think it still stacks up as one of the most sophisticated comedies ever filmed. It's a little later than Libeled Lady that we saw last week. That was 1936. Here we're 1941, and we're encountering, I would say, a kind of more mature, certainly more morally complicated figure of a comic heroine in the Barbara Stanwyck character. And of course, America is very different. It's not yet into the war. This film was actually made in the summer before America went to war. But in that opening sequence, you notice that there are not that many men around. You have a sense that the country is mobilizing. The fact that Lady Eve has come over is in itself kind of remarkable. At least it's worthy of remark in the film because, of course, Europe is at war. The other thing I think that's important to say is being a country that has come through the Depression, seemed to have survived it relatively intact, but nonetheless is on the brink of war. I think what we see in this film is comedy being used to investigate or reassess exactly what America's moral and as well as social and political values really come down to. And I think one of the ways the comedy does it is by moving from the first half of the film, which is concentrated on what most comedies are really interested in courtship rituals, the language of courtship, the kinds of sexual ideals, the kind of sexual attractiveness that society promotes and encourages and nurtures, particularly in those who are entrusted really with perpetuating society, that is young men and women eager to find a mate. But the second half of the film, we see that America is beginning to be, we could say, a little more nervous. We could also say a little more morally enlightened about the darker threads that sort of constitute American society or the relationships of men and women. And what I mean here is you can already see on the horizon the world of film noir that is about to open up. I think the switching point is that moment on the deck after Jean Harrington has been in some sense abandoned by the Henry Fonda character by Charlie Hopsy Pike. And she realizes that the check that she thought her father had torn up is in fact been preserved. And she says, I feel a lot better already. The way she says it sort of signals that something darker is emerging in her. So in a film where we have the title character in some sense named Eve, who in some sense evokes archetypal womanhood, we begin to see something of the figure of the femme fatale, the female revenger, at least someone who wants to, in some sense, teach her Adam, her innocent Adam, a lesson. So this film actually has sort of two parts. It has two heroines. One I would say is a comic heroine, although her comic nature is associated with guile. So there's a little more moral uneasiness than we got last week with Libeled Lady. But the second half is in some ways a little more sort of, at least to me, sort of intriguing, because the Lady Eve, who is so resplendent, we talked a lot about costuming, who really seems to be really featured in a kind of almost virginal sort of white, also a kind of sort of social pristine genealogy that she seems to carry with her, she's actually the femme fatale. She's the dark revenger. And I think as the movie moves towards its end, we feel even the spaces of the film sort of become more claustrophobic, especially in that final really horrific scene in the train where she exacts her revenge on the American Adam, the American innocent, Henry Fonda. So I guess I would propose this comedy as really a comedy about courtship, but also comedy, as the allusions to the Garden of Eden suggest. It's a comedy about moral enlightenment And in the tradition really of screwball comedy, it's finally the woman who has to sort of educate the man and the audience into what the limits of our innocence are and the time when it really becomes necessary for us to take a fall. It becomes necessary because we won't survive otherwise. Anyway, that's just a kind of, I don't know, kind of spectrum of issues that I think the film really presents to us, either in terms of the kinds of genre it's playing with and the kind of social and sexual types it really wants us to encounter, perhaps not always comfortably, but to encounter with a sense of kind of excitement about what this woman is going to do next. What card does she actually have up her sleeve? Okay, so with that kind of introduction, I'd be eager to hear from all and any of you, what your reactions were, both to the form of the comedy, to the particular character of Jean Harrington. And by one little footnote, if any of you know All About Eve, All About Eve actually has, All About Eve is, she's named Eve Harrington in some way. She's a kind of daughter of the Lady Eve. I think there's a very explicit allusion there. So I open it up for discussions. Chris, you'll call on people or?
Yes, Valorie?
Hi.
And then Elise. Yep.
Hi. I just wanted to comment that I thought it was a beautifully crafted movie.
Mm-hmm.
I liked the imagery with the blacks and white.
Yeah.
And I think even Jean, I know you think more Eve had the white resplendent, but there were many costumes that Jean wore that were also very white and very flowing. One scene in particular where you realize she's had a change of heart and she doesn't want to dupe Henry Fonda any longer. She wants to, she's really fallen in love with him. It makes the V. The two men make a V and she's at the center of the V. And I don't know if it's like a V for victory, like she's conquered that bad girl, so to speak. And has turned a corner, or I don't know, but it made a V, and it was a very striking contrast of black and white, and she's right at the center of that. I just thought the imagery was beautiful, and the train and the whistle, especially that one sign, pull in your head, you're in the tunnel. I don't know, like you're about to get your head knocked off, if you're not careful. And it just, so many double entendre. The writing was really crisp. I just loved it. I've seen it twice now, and I've always skipped that movie. I've only ever seen the clip where she trips him, and I never paid it. I thought, oh, I don't care to see that. Well, now I'm so glad I had to see it, because now I want to see it a third and a fourth time. So that's enough for me.
Elise?
I wanted to talk a little bit about the morality of what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like poor Henry Fonda is being punished very cruelly for nothing. He is the injured party. And, he had his feathers ruffled and he said, oh yeah, well, I knew you were scamming me the morning after we met. And to me, that was clearly just a face-saving fib. And yet, in the second half of the movie, the tone shifts so much that I thought of Eve or whoever as cruel, and as him as an innocent who should just, run the hell in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I'm wondering if other people felt the same way.
That's one thumbs up from Valorie. Yes, the name says David Kinsey. It's Suzanne, yeah? Up here, I'm gonna unmute you.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm using David's computer. This is my all-time favorite comedy. I just love it. And Elisa, I disagree. Obviously, Henry Fonda is this incredible innocent in this movie. But I think what's so brilliant about all the performances, but particularly Barbara Stanwyck, is watching her fall in love with him, which I think compensates for her downright, her guile and her downright con, that I think it's very genuine that she falls in love with him just when he finds out what she has done. And I think that redeems the cruelty. The other thing, which is on a completely different subject or topic, I think the performances are so brilliant, every single one. And the men are absolutely hilarious, every single character actor. It's part of what makes the picture such a joy. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck can carry the movie on her own, and she's the only woman, and yet she plays these two different women, both of which I think are extraordinary. And then you get Henry Fonda, and it is so sexy. I think this is the sexiest movie imaginable, especially given that, you know, it's when people couldn't show sex, but it's amazing. And then you get all these other characters that go from slapstick to very poignant. I don't know. I love this movie. I'm so glad we're talking about it.
Mhm.
Sharon?
Yes.
Sharon. Oh, I was just going to say that I think I agree with the person who said that it was hard to believe the character of Eve, her being such a cruel person, raised as a woman who's a card shark, raised in that milieu, falling in love. It was a little too much for me to understand the psychological makeup of this woman. And at the end, which was very funny, you know, the very funny moment when they both say they're married and they have different reasons for believing that they're married to different people. But anyway, what I thought was what Maria said at the beginning, it really is almost a presenting people that are almost sexually attracted, totally. I almost don't believe in the love, you know, the sort of the romantic love of the movie. I think it's more that these people were just, you know, attracted to each other in a physical way. And that was shown at the end because it's like, oh, they didn't care what had happened before. That was all thrown away because there was the person they were attracted to. That was my take. I'll mute myself.
Brian, yes.
I think one of the reasons why the Gene character falls for the Henry Fonda character so quickly is that he isn't innocent. He is probably the first person in her life who hasn't wanted her for something. Even when she was doing the cons and she was pretending to fall in love with these millionaires, or probably half of them were married already or engaged, Henry Fonda didn't want anything from her. Her father wants her to take part in these heists, and probably the men she seduces aren't the most innocent of people either. And I think that's what led to her falling in love so much. And as far as the sexiness of the film, this is probably the sexiest I've ever seen Barbara Stanwyck. And it's really regretful that we didn't see Henry Fonda in more comedies. I know him more from dramas and Westerns, but here he has such a talent for physical and verbal comedy. I kind of wish he would have done more in the genre.
We'll get to you in 1 second, Valerie. Harriet, you had your hand up?
Yes, I know Professor Battista has written her book called Fast Talking Dames, but absolutely everybody in this movie is fast talking. It's Fast Talking Dames and Gents could be your second volume. And the script is rapid fire. And I'm looking at his name, William Demarest gets a lot of this rapid fire speech too. He's kind of the butler who's the babysitter. And they have these constant plays on words. They took the name Murgatroyd and then they take it and make it troigomoid. They keep playing with words. And I looked very carefully for the name of the costumer, and it's the great Hollywood clothier, Edith Head. She dresses up the people in this movie who are even just passing by, men and women. So you get this rapid fire speech and these beautiful people, and this emerges as a very smart set movie. This is how the smart set talks, dresses, eats, drinks, and you pick up all this language and things to wear. What do you wear? Now, in terms of the second part being darker, I'm really laughing my head off at Barbara Stanwyck with a British accent, with these totally preposterous jokes made at the expense of British speech. Everything was ripping, and everything had some kind of play on British wordplay. And that ends up being even funnier, I'm sorry, than the first part. But the funniest part of the movie, well, musically, they're playing a lot of standards that people dance to. But while they're on the train, they used the music from the overture to Tannhäuser. This totally weird insertion of a piece of Wagnerian music and in some kind of musical Wagnerian search. I don't know why they did that, but it was very funny. Sorry to bring up a musical piece of humor.
Thank you, Harriet. Back to Valorie.
I just wanted to respond to Brian for a minute when he said he thought this was the sexiest Barbara Stanwyck movie. But have you ever seen Babyface? If you've seen her in Babyface, I think what she's selling. She's
Well,
working
that's
to the top, but she's very sexy in that too, I think.
yeah. Babyface has the most sex. It's a pre-code film, so she's just using it. It's a fantastic film. But I found her sexier in this.
Okay.
Probably because she didn't sleep with everybody in this one too.
Well, that's true. Also, to respond to Harriet, I love the use of the music because I thought it really this Preston Sturges had to have been a genius, because not only is it snappy dialogue, and then the framing of each scene is a metaphor for something else. And then the music too. I think the music is like another layer of metaphor for what's going on here. You know, there's, what was that? Cocktails for Two is one of the songs during the cocktail party. It's just ingenious, the whole styling of this film, I think.
I thought the pop standards just worked perfectly, but to throw Wagner in on a train scene, I said, where is this coming from? Where exactly is this train going?
Elizabeth, I saw your hand. Yes.
Wanted to chime in about the music. I had not remembered. I've seen this movie many times. It's one of my top favorite movies. But I was surprised. I hadn't recalled the two Rodgers and Hart songs in it, Lover and Isn't It Romantic? And both very songs that I love very much, and I enjoyed hearing them not just once, but kind of woven a little bit. And so I read something online when I was noodling about yesterday that indicating that it was not necessarily a very common thing at all in this era to use sort of a compilation of popular tunes in the way that this film did. And I'd be interested in learning more about that. And I wonder how much Sturges had to do with those kinds of aesthetic choices. But yeah, I did enjoy the music as well. And it's just so beautifully done. And when you think of so many films that you go to see nowadays that could be possibly decent or interesting films, but they're completely ruined by the overwhelming nature of the score. To me, anyway, this is a problem that they tell me what to feel, and I'm just not having any of it. But this film didn't do that. And when it did tell me what to feel, it was with a very knowing and sophisticated, point of view. So love the music.
Mhm, mhm.
Elise?
I would just like, as long as we're praising this fabulous musical, fabulous movie, I just have to give a Valentine to, all of the players, the Preston Sturges players,
Mhm.
that inhabit these fantastic character. They're just great character actors, like William Demarest, Eric Blore, Eugene. I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name. Who's the father of Henry Fonda, with that fabulous bullfrog voice, and we get the pleasure of hearing him singing A Christmas Carol. And the bursar on the ship, whose name I don't know, but I've seen him in 100 things. It's sort of like this group of amazing character actors who just give so much pleasure every time you see them. So I just wanted to shout out to them.
Yeah. He, like Wells, almost had a stock company of players. A studio often wasn't happy about that because they had their own, he did this film for Paramount, and sometimes they wanted him to use other actors, but he had a kind of camaraderie that he established on the set, and evidently this was one of the more joyous sets ever sort of recorded. Instead of going back to their trailers, the actors like to sort of sit on their chairs and kind of pal around and rehearse the scenes. He liked to get kind of in costumes and kind of act it out. So I think that there was a sense of a group of very sort of talented people sort of working together, improvising when that was sort of called for. As to the music, Sturges came from a kind of musical background. He knew a lot about music, but I think he did help sort of pioneer the idea that you could insert, or at least insinuate, popular melodies or popular song, not just to kind of reinforce the dramatic action, but actually to evoke the culture, let's say the culture of romance, okay, the culture of courtship, that we all sort of grow up with. Whatever your age is, that when you're a teenager in particular, you're listening to tunes that in some sense represent your sexual coming of age, or represents how you think of the opposite sex in terms of a kind of romantic ideal. And the movie is very explicit about that. The first time, the sort of first sexy scene where you see them together, that's the subject of their conversation, getting to Sharon's point about how are these people attracted to each other. And it's almost as if the language creates the sexual attraction, okay? It's done very sort of comically and deftly, and you can see the Eve character kind of teasing him, and what's your sexual idea? Oh, she sounds like Marguerite and Faust. So there's these gestures, right? There's these allusions to high artistic culture, as well as the realm of popular. So Tannhauser, Faust. And for those of you interested in music, this is a much darker comedy, but a couple of years later, he made a film called Unfaithfully Yours with Rex Harrison and Linda Darnell. And Rex Harrison plays a symphony conductor who thinks his wife is having an affair. And while he's conducting a concert, the various pieces in the concert, he imagined ways of, in some sense, revenging himself on his adulterous wife. And each piece, each symphonic or operatic piece, generates a different kind of fantasy. So the collision between this elevated, sophisticated symphonic or operatic music juxtaposed to these in some sense, sort of silly, but still, as in the second part of Lady Eve, morally unsettling fantasies of, in some sense, regaining your manhood, or in some sense, revenging yourself for what you feel is a sexual betrayal, is very much, I think, in line with the way Sturgis likes to kind of, how should I say, sort of jumble up, sort of get sort of different strands, either of music or of language, let's say very idiomatic American vernacular, like Muggsy, okay, or the idea of sucker sapiens, all of this kind of con man talk, okay? It's not particularly sort of sophisticated, along with the Britishism, so that when Lady Eve comes in, she talks about the tube and Connecticut. So the way it's different levels, not just different levels of class, different levels of language, but also different artistic means of expression, both high and low. I think he's really kind of a genius in some sense, weaving them or contriving a comedy that allows us to see how these different resonances actually can be brought together in a really kind of finely orchestrated piece. So I think that's really kind of important, just to sort of bring together some of the observations that many of you made, without necessarily dismissing, because I think it really gets the heart of this comedy. There is a darkness, I think, in the second half. But I think it's particularly that darkness, and it's not just in Eve. I mean, I think we see something about we see something in her determination to make him suffer, that suggests, I think, partly how deeply she feels betrayed, because she's allowed herself to become vulnerable, that she's allowed herself to fall in love. And from the very beginning, she seems to be somebody who likes to be in control. And she finds herself in the first part of the movie, in some sense, willing to cede control, at least after she has contrived to bring them together. But don't forget the second love scene that we see with Henry Fonda, when he's proposing to Lady Eve. He uses the same language. There's a sense of a kind of cynicism there, a sense that perhaps this is somebody who needs to be sort of taken down, or at least someone who really hasn't learned his lesson. And I think, it would be really lovely to think that we can learn about good being not as good as we think, and the bad not being as bad as we think, that we can learn these lessons easily without too much pain or suffering. But I just think there's a kind of willingness on Sturgis to sort of push the comic premise. Somebody's got to take a fall, literally take a fall. He takes a series of falls. And the last fall he takes, of course, is the most despondent one, is when he falls off the train. And you don't laugh at that because that's not slapstick. But I think he's sort of pushing that metaphor and pushing that kind of myth about what it means to become knowledgeable, to have knowledge. And what is when we take the bite of the apple, it's the knowledge of good and evil. You don't get that knowledge all that easily. So that it seems to me, this is a comedy that is really funny, very entertaining, extremely witty, but also not afraid to really make us sort of think about how difficult, emotionally difficult it is, not only to yield to being vulnerable in love, but how emotionally difficult it is essentially to sort of grow up. To see that the world is a morally sort of complicated place, and how difficult it is to forgive. I mean, this is a comedy. It's really about how willing are you to sort of forgive people, their lapses, even the pain that they have caused you. So I think it's in a way a very sort of profound film, but it's only profound because it's willing, in some sense, to take pain and insert it in a kind of comic situation.
John.
Wow, those are a lot of great points. agree with what you're saying. And I like the fact that you brought up Unfaithfully Yours, in talking about the darkness of the second half of The Lady Eve. In Unfaithfully Yours, I don't think Preston Sturges is as successful in walking the tightrope of doing something which is dark, but keeping your affection for the characters and for the Barbara Stanwyck character. Whereas the Rex Harrison in Unfaithfully Yours, the humor really starts to get a little bit strained as he's seeking his revenge. Not quite as funny. Whereas I think in The Lady Eve, she is seeking revenge, but it's played largely as farce until the very end. You know, all the pratfalls and all the hilarious scenes that go on during that party are incredibly funny, and culminating in Henry Fonda proposing and declaring his love for the second time, played totally as farce. She set the whole thing up, the horses are behind them, and he's going through the same routine, which was so touching and so emotional when he said those things on the deck of the ship, are now completely farcical and undercut by the horse bumping up against him and whinnying behind him. I think that totally undercuts any sense of, you know, that somehow Henry Fonda has been victimized. It's such a farce. And Henry, I just have to say also that Henry Fonda, and obviously Barbara Stanwyck is radiant and amazing in this film, and I think she's the best golden age actress with her subtlety and ability to shift emotions. But the more you watch this film, the more you realize how amazing Henry Fonda is, and how all of he's such a great straight man. He plays all of his lines perfectly. And there's a lot of humor in his innocence and being dumbfounded in double takes, that he really deserves a lot of the credit too for the success of the film.
Valorie, and then Suzanne.
Just to piggyback on what John was saying about Henry Fonda, without even using words, just watching his face, I don't know how he was able to make his face look so innocent and naive, like just with like a movement of his lip or a flutter of his eyelids. He just looked like the lost souls from, you know, like he's been literally a lost soul down in South America somewhere, and now coming back after a year away. He's got that sort of, you know, a cow in the city for the first time kind of a look. And then by the end of the movie, when it's the last 5 minutes, and he's walking through the ship's lobby again, and he passes Jean again. Look at his face again. His face now is somebody more determined and a little stronger. And even it looks lined. His forehead looked lined and creased. So to me, it was just, you were able to see him go from naive dupe to, you know, somebody who's never going to be duped again by the end of the movie, just by his facial gestures, facial features. I don't know how he did that, but he deserves, he deserved accolades for that, I think. So I agree with you, John.
Suzanne?
I also wanted to talk about class and money, because it's another great theme of Preston Sturges, not just in this movie, but in many of his movies. And it sort of plays all through the movie. I mean, she's a card shark. That's how she and her father make a living. And again, to get to the secondary characters, you have Muggsy on the one hand, and I don't know the name of the character who's their butler, or, you know,
right. They're Confederate, really, but he's
Confederate, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, she goes from
Gerald,
her guile, playing this one role on the ship, and then transforming into the Lady Eve, which is again all about money and European sophistication, which the whole salon is completely taken with. And then it switches, I think, very interestingly, that after her, after it comes out that she's not the Lady Eve, that she's deceived Hopsy, the father, that the Eugene, what's his character, is very movingly on the phone with her, talking about he won't forgive you. And yet you wouldn't expect him, a man of his class, to be so taken with this woman who has deceived her son, but he is. So I think Sturgis is playing with money and class and Europeans and Americans and who's doing what in just these very sophisticated and interesting ways.
Yes, Craig.
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting to compare this with the movie we watched last week, in that last week, the person with the money was, and the power or money and class was female, and the person trying to get it was male. And this week, the movie, those roles were completely flipped around. My question was more along the lines of how audiences felt about this at the time, because it seems like this was kind of a novel, have that switch between now the woman they're in different roles. I wondered if audiences were buying this at the time, and how that compares with how we would look at it today.
I'm sorry, do you mean how audiences would take what? I'm not exactly sure with the.
And I thought it was kind of unusual that in this movie, the woman character was the more manipulative, trying to get class and that from a male, which was the complete opposite of in Libeled Ladies. And I wondered if that was considered controversial for audiences in the 1941 watching. It seems unusual.
I mean, if someone else would like to answer, yeah, Harriet. Harriet, did you want to answer?
I think there's a clue at the very outset of the movie that we haven't discussed, and that's the fact that the credits are done as a cartoon. And it shows what I think is the tree of knowledge and the snake slithering around and that apple kind of going, and the men come out of the jungle. And they had a very revealing line where they said they had seen no dames for a very long time. They didn't have anything to dodge but reptiles. And there's this feeling, I mean, as soon as they say that, I say, well, if you've been dodging reptiles, dodging dames will be a pushover, is kind of a kind of tongue-in-cheek comment about the woman as seductress. And they've been dodging what did he call himself? I had to look this up. An ophthalmologist. They've been ophthalmologists for a year, dodging reptiles, even takes a pet snake home, and he has to eat cockroaches from the luxury liner. And after dodging, after being ophthalmologists for a year, they're prepared to dodge dames. Poisonous snakes and dames after your fork. And let us not forget that this elegant family, I love this, made its money on the ale that won for Yale. This is not some fine old New England family that came over on the Mayflower. They're in the beer business. And there's that wonderful line
Beer,
from the
no,
bartender-
ale.
from the bartender when he says, what should they do if they're out of this? And he says, go to Harvard.
Yeah, let them go to Harvard. Yeah.
That's the answer. I mean, they're very dismissive of something so serious. This ale.
I just see, I'm sorry,
Sharon?
yes,
Sorry,
Slope.
I should have renamed myself.
Yeah.
That was a good question that Craig had, and I was just wondering, it seems like, I was trying to think over the time in movies that the class thing isn't really always one sex or the other. I think there's a lot of movies where the woman is after the man with a lot of money and then vice versa. And I was getting really mixed up getting prepared for this discussion because I also saw I binge watched an Australian soap opera called Place Called Home, which also begins with a shipboard romance with a woman who doesn't have a lot of money, who falls in love with a sort of a Downton Abbey type from Australia. And then this week, I also saw a brand new movie by Steven Soderbergh called Let Them All Talk, which takes place entirely on the Queen Mary II, which I really recommend. And that movie is also about class and issues of class. And I also think it's interesting to have a movie take place so much of the time on a ship where people can disappear, people can go behind closed doors, and there's all those sort of interesting things about the location also for romance. That's all I'll say.
John?
Yeah, I was just laughing at one of the all-time great moments of the film is when Charles tries to, when she says, when Jean says, what's the difference between beer and ale? Beer and ale, my father would burst a blood vessel. There's a big difference. Ale is sort of fermented on the top or something, and the beer is fermented on the bottom. And he goes on, and it's very amusing, which reminded me of another thing, which is really great about a lot of films from the Golden Age, but particularly this film, is how long the takes are. The shots are that in the movie. There are shots that go on typically for 30 seconds, 40 seconds without a cut. And I think it really draws you in and gives you a sense of immediacy, which films that do a lot of, back and forth editing don't accomplish. And that's especially in those two scenes, these two stateroom scenes in the beginning, when the first one where Charles picks her shoes for her. A couple of the shots go, one goes 45 seconds, the other goes 30 seconds. And then the second time they're back in the stateroom, when she's been agitated by the snake, and she is on the floor next to her couch, and she's telling him what her ideal is, which again is priceless writing by Sturgis. That lasts over 3 minutes without a cut, which is just extraordinary. And it is also a testament to what great acting is going on.
Elise.
That is my favorite scene in the whole movie by far, John. I hope you agree with me. The look on Henry Fonda's face, he looks lost, he looks stricken, he looks like he's about to throw up, and it looks like he's falling in love. He just, with his facial expression, he conveys something very complicated. And I agree with whoever commented earlier that I wish I'd seen him in more comedies, for what that's worth.
He did do a couple of comedies in the 30s, one with Margaret Sullivan, who I think he was married to at the time, or he was recently divorced. Can't remember the name of it. And he actually did another comedy with Stanwyck, but this is really Fonda at his peak. But I think it's also because of what you're all saying about the dramatic expressiveness of his face. So he can be essentially a kind of arrested adolescent coming out of the Amazon. What he says is, you know me, nothing but reptiles. It's just like he's had this sort of prolonged vacation in the Amazon, playing with snakes. Doesn't even seem to strike him that this is the sexual symbol par excellence. And the movie has a lot of like Freudian fun with sort of snakes. And I think it's also a kind of key to the Barbara Stanwyck character that when she actually sees a snake, she's frightened by it, because before that we're expected to believe that she's pretty sexually sophisticated, that one of the reasons she's on board is in some sense to seduce all of these richer older men. In fact, she complains, one of the first things she says, she complains to her father, why don't you push him? Why do I have to do sort of all the work? So I think that seeing how he in some sense matures from this really almost kind of oblivious adolescent who isn't really aware, much less in touch with his own sexuality, to somebody who becomes cockeyed. That's the way that, he's really kind of made drunken. He's inebriated by the perfume, not by the ale, but by the perfume. And all of a sudden, you just feel that his manhood is really being roused. And I think that the probably the most striking use, and I love the way you said that about his face in some sense showing a kind of just a moral shock, is when he looks at the picture that Muggsy gives him and understands, or at least he thinks he understands, that he has really been taken advantage of. The camera really focuses on him. It's one of the few close-ups we actually get just of his face, as if we want to sort of see this moment of enlightenment. Again, a very unpleasant enlightenment, but a necessary one. And I've always thought that what Sturgis had in mind was a kind of memory that he hoped the audiences would have, that this is the actor who played the young Abe Lincoln. So there's something about kind of the American, kind of American, straightforward, solid manhood, and how that too, in some sense, has to be kind of morally challenged. But my favorite Henry Fonda moment is actually at the very end, when he sees Eve, and all of a sudden, it's the first time in the movie, and it's an important moment where he takes charge. Everything else in the movie, she's in charge. She trips him, introduces herself. She's always sort of orchestrating, manipulating. She makes her living with her hand. She manipulates him, sort of is constantly sort of conniving to get him to do what she wants him to do, even get him into that small claustrophobic space in the train so she can work her revenge. But he really just kind of picks her, sort of picks her up. And when he goes down those stairs with her and she can't keep up with him, it's just, to me, it's one of the great exhilarating conclusions in comedy. He's both manly, he's excited, he knows where he's going, and he's taking her with her. And there's something about that kind of comic momentum that suggests really he's sort of come of age. And then it leads to that sort of beautiful banter behind closed doors, okay? And the last words are positively the same dame, which I think is a kind of clue to us. Yes, that she has both parts. She's both good and bad, positively the same dame. It's something he has to actually sort of accept. And once he does, he's actually happier than if he would be allowed to remain in this kind of sexual paradise that he had sort of seen. The first sexual paradise is just full of snakes. The second sexual paradise is when he just feels like all he has to do is just, be near her perfume, but that's not an actual person. So in some ways, the comedy, I think, is sort of very subtle. And I think all of you are right that Stanwyck is absolutely remarkable. Like John, she's my favorite actress, bar none. She can do it all. But Fonda, in some sense, the heart of the comedy depends on Fonda, on his face, on his movements. And I think just his sort of willingness ultimately to make himself sort of vulnerable, but also I think to take a fall. I think that can't be it can't be underestimated. You really have to take a fall. That's what the Garden of Eden is always sort of telling us, to be sort of fully human.
Tom?
Yeah, I love your comment that I hadn't ever thought of, that the Positively the Same Dame is a perfect, was taking that totally from Muggsy in the sense of an American vernacular, but of course the term dame applies to the Lady Eve. And I just thought that was, it just combines the two with The Last Shot. I've seen the film a lot of times, and it wasn't until the third or fourth time that I saw it. Right up before that, he's taking her down the stairs, but they go into her stateroom, not his stateroom. He's and he's saying, can't we go somewhere like your stateroom? And then he says, I shouldn't be in your room because I'm married. And then she says, I'm married too. Then Muggsy comes out, and it wasn't until, I don't know, the third or fourth time I saw the movie that I said, wait a second, what's Muggsy doing in her stateroom? And I checked the script, and that's the way it was written. And it's a really peculiar little side footnote. Obviously, Sturgis, that wasn't a mistake. I mean, he obviously, but it's just odd that, what was the point of that? I mean, it's a wonderful device, and there's a lot of things in comedies like this that don't have to add up, and it doesn't bother me, but it's just a curious detail.
Yeah, I think the expulsion of Muggsy is the sign that Henry Fonda is now a grown man. He's kind of like the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. That Muggsy has not only protected him, against kidnappers or whatever, against con men, but also sexually protected him, and therefore, in a way, infantilized him. So, I also sort of love that moment, because he brings to the film a sexual suspicion that I think we all have towards the type of woman that Barbara Stanwyck represents. And part of that suspicion has to do is that she really wants to take her fate in her own hands. And also, sort of getting back to Craig's point, she's clearly a working girl, lower class, trying to, in some sense, work her way into sort of higher society, initially just to fleece them, and then when she falls in love, maybe to sort of marry them. But I think, getting back to Craig, to sense of your, how the audience is, I think one of the keys is, first of all, what Harriet says, it does begin with a cartoon. So there's a sense that there's something about the archetypes of American womanhood that Sturgis wants to have fun with. But you remember that opening scene where they go to the first time we see them in the States room, and she's got this compact mirror and she's looking at all of the women who are sort of coming on to him. That's kind of like an inventory of all the possible sort of social types, from the ingenue to the lady champion wrestler. So you just sort of have this gallery of comic American sort of women. And I also think it's a kind of, again, a kind of homage to silent film, because all of these women are really, they're not given language, they're just sort of gesticulating, and they're, the dropped kerchief. So I think that Sturgis is having cartoonish fun with a kind of sexual mores and manners that we sort of take for granted, but that he really wants to have fun with, but also it ends with her saying, "Not good enough, not good enough." Every Jane is giving him the eye. And I think with that "not good enough," he's sort of signaling, you need a new kind of woman, a more sophisticated, a little more dangerous, at the other hand, more knowledgeable and ultimately more exciting.
We have a question from the comments, and I'll get to you, Harriet, after this.
Okay, sure.
But I don't know if this is for you, Maria, or if anyone else can share insight, but asked how Fonda was chosen for the role, and that there were likely other actors considered.
Actually, I'm not sure. Might have been, they might have been thinking maybe about Fred McMurray or something, but I'd have to look at it, but it was inspired. It was inspired casting. And Fonda, and years later would always say that he fell in love with Barbara Stanwyck, particularly after this film. And they had a kind of, let's say, platonic romance that lasted really to the end of his life. He sort of died first, but you could see the incredible sort of chemistry, and they were just both just amazingly skillful actors, very natural. I think that's part of it. Unlike Joan Crawford or Bette Davis, Stanwyck, particularly in a movie like this, she just seems, no matter whether she's speaking American English or English, or whether she's just speaking to herself, you just feel that the language really comes out of her naturalistically. You don't have what I call the Bette Davis or Meryl Streep effect, where you just see the actor really turning on the technique. You don't see her technique. And Fonda has that same, I just think, magical ability to make it seem as this is somebody that you could meet if you ever ended up on shipboard.
Harriet?
Yes, just riffing on all the incredible things you said about Henry Fonda. There's a scene where she's in love and she says, "I've fallen in love with you, you big lug." Now, you can say a lot of things about Henry Fonda, but you're never, ever going to call him a big lug. But that becomes part of her, what you call fast talking dame talk. And I wonder if after this movie, people go out and start calling their boyfriends big lugs.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how you take lug is a really lower class, vulgar term.
Not Henry Fonda.
No, but what I think it's kind of like Muggsy, or when she teases him Hopsy Popsy, when she sort of said, it's like she sort of creates this language of endearment. Yeah, I don't know if people went out and say you big lug, but it does, it does appear sometimes in comedies, but it's always a way of sort of undercutting out of affection. Yeah. I mean, not meant to demean him at all. The real demeaning, and I think this goes to Elise's point, the real demeaning is when she gets him, in that train, and they're again, it's sort of claustrophobic. What do you call it? The window, the window thing comes down. It's almost kind of a blank screen there, and she just starts sort of fantasizing all of these high class names, and all of the kind of ways, and she can euphemistically sort of talk about her sexual escapades, or really her nymphomania. That's what's meant to be demeaning.
It's pronounced Cecil.
Cecil, yes, it's Cecil. So that's the demeaning. That's the demeaning. And of course, I hope you picked up the way Sturgis uses not only the musical sound effects, but the whistle. So the first time you hear the whistle, again, he's coming out of the Amazon, and that it's really kind of a poor performance of a whistle. And it's meant to suggest that he's sexually immature. But when they're going through the tunnel, and if you think of North by Northwest, Hitchcock also likes to use this image for sort of sexual penetration. The train goes through the tunnel, but the whistle is now, it's a shriek. It's a sign again that he's now playing for sort of higher stakes. Just one of the many, you know, to me, ravishing touches of this film, where the very vulgarity in some sense could be the language of endearment. That's very American. The British would never admit or allow for that kind of appropriation.
Well, we are just over an hour, and I see that people are starting to drop off. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us for both of these films. We do have a bit of a break in our programming here until later in January, so hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your holiday season, and hope that 2020 doesn't end, that all of the craziness that's happened in 2020 is beyond us, and it's just uphill from here and on. But looking forward to seeing you all in January, and looking for notes, or just look for our emails for what the upcoming discussions will be. Maria, do you have anything you wanted to add just in closing?
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to be part of this group. Thank you for your comments, your observations, your discussions. You're a great group, and it's really been a pleasure to talk about these films, which I love, with you.
Well, thank you so much for leading us through this and for picking these great titles. Thank you, Maria.
Sure.
Thank you, Maria.